The morning started like any other for Harold Hal Morrison. He sat on his wooden porch watching the sunrise paint the mountains behind his remote cabin in shades of gold and pink. At 78 years old, Hal had seen plenty of sunrises, but he never got tired of them. His weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as he listened to the birds wake up in the forest around his property. Hal had lived alone in these Montana woods for the past 15 years, ever since his wife Martha had passed. The nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and that was exactly how he liked it. People in the small town below thought he was just another grumpy old man who wanted to be left alone. They had no idea what he had done before retirement, and Hal preferred to keep it that way. The cabin looked simple from the outside. Old logs, a metal roof, and a stone chimney that sent lazy smoke into the cool morning air. Inside, it was comfortable but basic. A stone fireplace, handmade furniture, and shelves full of books about gardening, woodworking, and history. What visitors couldn't see was the hidden basement, built with reinforced concrete and steel. Down there, behind a false wall, Hal kept reminders of his previous life. He had served in military units that officially didn't exist, units that handled problems the government couldn't acknowledge. For 35 years, Hal had been deployed to places that weren't on any map, fighting enemies that the public never heard about. He had skills that most people couldn't imagine, and he had used those skills to keep humanity safe from threats they never knew existed. But all that was behind him now. Or so he thought. The first sign something was wrong came just after noon. Hal was in his garden, pulling weeds from around his tomato plants, when he noticed the birds had gone quiet. Complete silence in a forest was never a good sign. He straightened up, his old joints protesting, and listened carefully. Nothing. Not even the sound of insects. Then he felt it. A strange vibration in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. The hair on his arms stood up and his skin tingled with static electricity. Hal had felt this before, many years ago, during classified operations he couldn't talk about even now. He dropped his gardening tools and walked quickly back to the cabin. Inside, he went to a seemingly ordinary bookshelf and pulled out a thick volume about American history. Behind it was a hidden panel with several switches and a small screen. Hal flipped the switches in a specific sequence, and the screen came to life. The readings made his blood run cold. Energy signatures unlike anything from Earth. Dimensional distortions that suggested advanced technology. And they were getting stronger, which meant whatever was coming was getting closer. Hal had spent years after his retirement hoping he would never see readings like this again. He had hoped the threats he had fought in secret would stay in the dark corners of the universe where they belonged. But hope, as he had learned long ago, was not a strategy. Moving with surprising speed for his age, Hal went to his bedroom and pulled up a loose floorboard. Underneath was a metal case that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a communication device that used technology decades ahead of anything the public knew about. He powered it up and sent a coded message to contacts who might not even be alive anymore. The reply came back in minutes. 3 words that confirmed his worst fears. "They found you." Hal sat on his bed and closed his eyes, feeling every one of his 78 years. He had known this day might come. When you spent your life fighting monsters, sometimes the monsters learned to fight back. Sometimes they remembered your face, your name, your world. Sometimes they came looking for revenge. But he was tired. Bone deep, soul deep, tired. He had given everything to keep Earth safe, and he had earned his peace. He had buried too many friends, seen too much darkness, and carried too many secrets. All he wanted now was to tend his garden, read his books, and watch the sunrises until his time came naturally. The communication device buzzed again. Another message. "Evacuation team en route. Estimated arrival 6 hours." 6 hours. Hal almost laughed. They would be here in minutes, not hours. The energy readings were spiking every few seconds, and the dimensional barriers were already breaking down. Whatever was coming had technology that made human science look like cave paintings. He typed back, "Too late. Begin Protocol 7. Protocol 7. Complete communication blackout. Assume the asset was lost. Don't come looking. Don't send rescue. Don't acknowledge the asset ever existed." It was the protocol for when an operation went so wrong that the only choice was to cut all ties and hope the damage could be contained. Hal shut down the device and put it back in its case. Then he went to his kitchen and made himself a sandwich. Turkey and cheese on bread he had baked himself. If this was going to be his last meal, it might as well be a good one. The attack came just as he finished eating. The air above his property tore open like someone had sliced through reality with a giant knife. Through the tier stepped figures in armor that seemed to be made of liquid metal and starlight. They were tall, maybe 8 feet, with proportions that were almost human, but not quite right. Too long in the limbs, too narrow in the waist. Their faces were hidden behind helmets that showed no features except 2 burning points of light where eyes should be. Hal counted 12 of them as they spread out around his cabin. Universe soldiers, the intelligence reports had called them. Elite warriors from a civilization that spanned multiple dimensions. They came from a realm where war was science and violence was art. Each soldier had the strength to tear apart armored vehicles and weapons that could level city blocks. One of them spoke, and its voice echoed strangely, as if it was coming from very far away and very close at the same time. The words were in English, but with an accent that belonged to no human language. "Harold Morrison, known as Wraith during your service years. You have been judged guilty of crimes against the Universal Collective. You destroyed our forward bases in dimensions 447 through 451. You eliminated 17 research stations and killed over 3,000 of our warriors. You prevented our expansion into your reality cluster for 47 years. Hal opened his front door and stepped onto his porch. He was still wearing his gardening clothes, old jeans, a flannel shirt, and work boots. His gray hair was uncombed and his hands were still dirty from pulling weeds. He looked like exactly what he was supposed to be, a harmless old man enjoying his retirement. "Boys," he said, his voice calm and friendly, "I think you might have the wrong address. I'm just a retired guy who grows vegetables and reads books. I've never heard of any universal collective or dimensions whatever you said." The soldiers raised their weapons. They looked like rifles made of crystal and electricity. Hal had seen weapons like that before, had faced soldiers like these in battles the world would never know about. But that was when he was young and fast and angry. That was when he had backup and superior firepower and the absolute certainty that he was fighting for humanity's survival. Now he was old and alone and tired. "We know who you are, Wraith," the lead soldier said. "We have hunted you across 17 years and 43 dimensions. Your allies have hidden you well, but not well enough. Today, we deliver justice for our fallen." Hal sighed and sat down on his porch steps. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun, and he could smell the pine trees and the flowers Martha had planted years ago. It was a good place to die, he thought. Better than some god-forsaken battlefield in a dimension that didn't have a name. "Well," he said, "if you're going to do this thing, mind if I ask you something first?" The soldiers looked at each other. Hal could almost feel their confusion through their armor. They had expected fear, pleading, maybe an attempt to run or fight. They hadn't expected an old man who seemed more tired than scared. "Speak," the leader said. "How did you find me?" Hal asked. "I mean, I've been pretty careful about staying off the radar. No credit cards, no internet, no contact with my old life. I even grow my own food and chop my own wood. What gave me away?" "Your biosignature," the soldier replied. Every being leaves traces when they interact with dimensional energy. You have used our technology extensively. The traces never fade completely. Hal nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. I always wondered about that. We never really understood how your equipment worked, just how to break it. He looked up at the sky, where the dimensional tear was still open, showing glimpses of a red sun and metallic structures. Nice job finding me, by the way. Only took you 17 years. I was starting to think you'd given up. We never give up, the leader said. We never forget. Yeah, Hal said softly. I figured as much. He stood up slowly, his knees creaking with age. The soldiers tensed, their weapons tracking his movement. But Hal just walked over to his mailbox and opened it. Inside was a single letter from his nephew in California. He opened it and read it quickly. Good news, he said to the soldiers. My great-niece made the honor roll at her school. Smart kid, wants to be a doctor. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. Her grandmother, my sister, used to worry that there wouldn't be a world left for kids like her to grow up in. I spent my whole career making sure she was wrong about that. The lead soldier stepped forward. Enough. You will face justice for your crimes. Hal laughed, and there was no humor in it. Justice? Boys, do you know what I was doing when I hit your bases? I was stopping you from turning my entire reality cluster into a hunting ground. Your people were planning to harvest humans like cattle and strip mine our dimensions for resources. I read your reports, saw your experimental facilities. You were going to wipe out billions of innocent people. They were inferior beings, the soldier said. It is natural law. The strong consume the weak. Is that what you tell yourselves? Hal shook his head. I've heard that before. From humans who thought they could decide who deserved to live and who deserved to die. From creatures in other dimensions who thought their technology gave them the right to erase entire civilizations. You know what I learned fighting all of them? The soldiers didn't answer, but Hal could feel their attention focused on him like the weight of gravity. I learned that the strong don't always win, he said. Sometimes the stubborn do. Sometimes the ones who refuse to give up, who keep fighting even when they're outnumbered and outgunned and completely outclassed. He looked each soldier in their glowing eyes. Sometimes the old and tired ones who just want to be left alone. The leader raised his weapon. Your words change nothing. Your execution will serve as a message to any who would defy the collective. Execution? Hal smiled. And for just a moment something flickered behind his eyes. Something cold and sharp and infinitely dangerous. Boys, you made one hell of a mistake coming here. You are one aged human with no weapons, no armor, and no allies, the soldier said. What threat could you possibly... Hal moved. After spending decades fighting enemies in the shadows between dimensions, after 35 years of classified operations that pushed the boundaries of what humans could do, after countless missions where failure meant the extinction of his entire species, Hal had learned to hide more than just his location. He had learned to hide what he really was. The porch exploded into splinters as Hal launched himself at the nearest soldier. His fist, enhanced by technology that had been surgically implanted so long ago he had forgotten what it felt like to be fully human, punched through the creature's armor like it was made of paper. The soldier's scream echoed across dimensions as it collapsed, its weapon clattering to the ground. The other soldiers opened fire, but Hal was already gone, moving faster than their targeting systems could track. He had spent years learning to fight creatures like these, studying their tactics, their technology, their weaknesses. The universe soldiers were powerful, but they were used to enemies who fought like civilized beings. They weren't prepared for someone who fought like a human. Hal grabbed the fallen soldier's weapon and rolled behind his truck as energy blasts turned the vehicle into molten metal. He came up firing, and 2 more soldiers went down before they could adjust their positions. The crystal rifle felt familiar in his hands, like greeting an old enemy that had become a bitter friend. The remaining soldiers spread out, trying to surround him. They moved with military precision, communicating through their armor's systems in frequencies humans couldn't hear. But Hal had learned to read their body language during years of war, and he knew what they were planning before they did it. He sprinted toward the forest, drawing their fire away from his cabin. The trees around him burst into flame as energy bolts missed their target. But Hal knew these woods like he knew his own heartbeat. Every path, every fallen log, every place where the ground dipped or rose. He had spent 15 years walking these trails, and he had spent the last 5 years preparing for exactly this kind of fight. The soldiers followed him into the forest, their armor's sensors scanning for heat signatures and movement. What they didn't know was that Hal had spent years learning to mask his biosigns, to move without leaving the traces that normal humans couldn't avoid. The technology that let them track him across dimensions worked differently when he was on his home ground, surrounded by systems he had spent years preparing. The first soldier to reach the tree line stepped on a pressure plate hidden under fallen leaves. The explosion sent it flying 20 feet through the air, its armor cracked and sparking. The second soldier made it another 10 yards before a tripwire activated a device that had been waiting in the trees for 5 years, just in case. By the time the surviving soldiers realized they were walking into a killing ground that had been prepared by someone who knew exactly what they were, Hal had vanished into the forest like smoke. And deep in the woods, surrounded by traps and weapons and technology that officially didn't exist, the old man who had once been called Wraith began to remember why he had earned that name. The hunt lasted 3 hours. In those 3 hours, 9 Universe soldiers died in Hal's forest. They died to traps that had been waiting patiently for years, to weapons that fired from angles they couldn't predict, to an old man who moved through the trees like he was part of them. Each death taught the survivors something new about their target. But the lessons came too late to save their comrades. The last soldier stood in a clearing, surrounded by the smoking remains of its squad. Its armor was scored with blast marks, and its weapon had been damaged in the running battle. Through its helmet's display, it tried to understand what had happened to its perfectly planned mission. Universe soldiers were the elite of the collective. They had conquered 17 dimensions and eliminated countless threats to their expansion. They had weapons that could tear holes in reality and armor that could withstand the explosion of stars. They were trained from birth to be the ultimate warriors, and they had never faced a single enemy who could stand against them. Until today. "Attention, soldier," came Hal's voice from somewhere in the trees around the clearing. The old man sounded like he was having a casual conversation, not like someone who had just eliminated an elite military unit. "I want you to go home now." The soldier raised its weapon, scanning the forest through its targeting system. But the sensors showed nothing. No heat signature, no electromagnetic emissions, no movement. It was like fighting a ghost. "I cannot retreat," the soldier said. "I cannot fail my mission." "Son," Hal said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "Your mission failed the moment you decided to come to my home. But I'm going to give you a choice your buddies didn't get. You can walk back through that dimensional tear of yours, go home to your people, and tell them what happened here. Or you can stay and join your friends." The soldier looked around at the remains of its squad. They had been the best of the best, and they had been taken apart like children playing with toy soldiers. The human had used their own weapons against them, had turned their technology into traps, had fought with a combination of primitive cunning and advanced knowledge that shouldn't have been possible. "What are you?" the soldier asked. Hal stepped out from behind a tree, moving with that unsettling speed that seemed to ignore the laws of physics. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, an old human in dirty clothes, tired and worn down by years of life. But the soldiers' sensors detected something else now, something they had missed before. Energy signatures that didn't match any known human technology, biomodifications that enhanced strength, speed, and reflexes beyond normal limits. Neural implants that interfaced with systems the collective had never seen before. This wasn't just a human. This was something that had been built to fight creatures like them. "I'm a retired guy who wants to tend his garden," Hal said. "But I used to be something else. I used to be the thing your people sent nightmares about back when they still had imagination enough to dream." The soldier's weapon systems locked onto Hal, but its finger hesitated on the trigger. Every tactical analysis it ran came back with the same result: insufficient data to predict combat outcome. Its squad had been eliminated by an enemy that shouldn't have been able to threaten even one of them. "Tell your bosses something for me," Hal continued. "Tell them that Wraith sends his regards. Tell them that if they want to finish what they started here, they're welcome to try. But tell them to bring more soldiers next time. A lot more." The soldier lowered its weapon, not in surrender, but in recognition of reality. It had a choice between certain death and possible survival. The mathematics were simple. "This is not over," it said. "No," Hal agreed. "It's not." The soldier walked backward toward the dimensional tear that still hung in the air above the cabin. It kept its weapon ready, but both it and Hal knew the fight was over for now. When it reached the portal, it stepped through without another word. The tear snapped shut, leaving Hal alone in his forest. But he wasn't done. Not even close. Hal walked back to his cabin and stood looking at the damage. His truck was a melted pile of metal. His porch was splinters. His garden had been trampled and burned. 15 years of peaceful retirement had been destroyed in one afternoon. He went inside and down to his hidden basement. Past the false wall, in a room that was bigger than it should have been based on the cabin's dimensions, Hal began to prepare for war. The equipment had been waiting for him. Weapons that used principles human science wouldn't discover for decades. Armor that could turn bullets into light and absorb energy blasts like a sponge. Communication devices that could reach across dimensional barriers. Computers that could hack into systems that didn't use anything resembling human technology. But most importantly, he had the coordinates. During his active years, Hal had built a network of contacts, allies, and information sources that spanned multiple realities. He had fought alongside rebels in the collective's conquered dimensions, had helped evacuate civilians from worlds marked for destruction, had learned the secret paths between realities that the collective used for their expansion. He knew where they lived. The collective's home dimension was called Realm Prime, a reality where physics worked differently and the laws of nature bent to serve technology. It was protected by defensive systems that made it nearly impossible to attack, defended by armies that numbered in the billions. It was the heart of an empire that controlled thousands of dimensional clusters and had never been successfully invaded. Hal powered up his communication array and began reaching out to old contacts. Some had died in the years since his retirement. Some had moved beyond the reach of his equipment. But some were still there, still fighting the good fight in the dark spaces between realities. The first to answer was someone called Echo, a voice without a body that existed in the gaps between dimensions. Hal had saved Echo's people from a collective harvesting operation 20 years ago, and the debt had never been forgotten. "Wraith," Echo's voice came through the speakers like wind through broken glass. "We thought you were dead." "Retirement," Hal said, "but they found me." "The collective?" "Universe soldiers, 12 of them. I sent one home with a message." There was silence for a long moment. Then, "You eliminated 11 Universe soldiers? Alone?" "I'm out of practice," Hal said. "Should have been all 12. Echo laughed, a sound like crystal bells breaking. "What do you need?" "Everything you have on current collective positions. troop movements, supply lines, command structures, and I need passage to Realm Prime. Another silence. Wraith, what you're suggesting is suicide. Realm Prime is protected by... I know what it's protected by, Hal interrupted. I helped design some of those defenses, remember? Before they kicked me out of the program. That was the part of Hal's history that even his closest allies didn't know. Before he became Wraith, before he started hunting collective forces across the dimensions, he had been part of a classified program that studied captured collective technology. He had learned their systems from the inside, had helped develop countermeasures and offensive capabilities based on their own designs. And he had been quietly building back doors into every system he helped analyze. You still have access? Echo asked. We're about to find out, Hal said. Over the next 6 hours, as night fell over the Montana mountains, Hal rebuilt his network. Allies who had thought he was dead came back online. Resistance groups in occupied dimensions suddenly found their communications working again. Rebels who had been fighting hopeless battles for years discovered that someone was coordinating their efforts, turning random strikes into part of a larger strategy. The collective had made two critical mistakes. First, they had assumed that eliminating Hal Morrison would be simple because he was old and alone. Second, they had assumed that his network would die with him. They were wrong on both counts. By midnight, Hal had assembled a strike force of volunteers from 17 different realities. Former collective prisoners who wanted revenge, survivors of harvested worlds who had nothing left to lose, technical specialists who understood collective systems better than the collective did themselves. And at the center of it all, an old man who had once promised his dying wife that he would never go back to war. But some promises, Hal had learned, were less important than others. The assault plan was elegantly simple. While the main collective forces were scrambling to understand how one human had eliminated a squad of universe soldiers, Hal and his volunteers would slip into Realm Prime through maintenance tunnels that existed outside normal space-time. They would target the central command facility that controlled the collective's expansion into other dimensions, and they would burn it all down. Hal suited up in armor that felt like a second skin. The biomodifications in his body interfaced with the suit's systems, enhancing his already considerable abilities to levels that would have seemed impossible to any normal human. He was 78 years old, but inside the armor he moved like a man in his prime. His weapons were custom-built for fighting collective forces. Each one was designed to exploit weaknesses in their technology, to turn their own strengths against them. He had spent years perfecting these tools, and now he would find out if they worked as well as his simulations suggested. The dimensional portal opened in his basement, creating a pathway to coordinates that shouldn't have existed. Hal stepped through, followed by fighters from realities that had names humans couldn't pronounce. They emerged in a place that was between places, where the normal laws of physics were more like gentle suggestions. From there, they had a 3-hour journey through maintenance conduits that the collective's builders had never bothered to secure. After all, who would be crazy enough to attack Realm Prime? Who would even know how to find these hidden pathways? The answer, as the collective was about to learn, was someone who had helped map those pathways in the first place. Hal led his team through passages that twisted through dimensions, that existed in spaces too small and too large at the same time. His armor's systems guided him through routes he had memorized decades ago, paths he had hoped never to use. They reached their target just as the collective's morning shift was beginning. Realm Prime operated on a 36-hour cycle, and the command center would be fully staffed with officers who had never imagined their home could be attacked. Hal planted charges on the dimensional stabilizers that kept the command facility anchored in normal space. Then he and his team went hunting. The battle inside the command center lasted 27 minutes. That was how long it took for Hal and 17 volunteers to fight their way through security forces that outnumbered them 50-1 to capture or eliminate every command officer in the facility, and to begin broadcasting shutdown codes to collective operations across 43 dimensions. When the stabilizer charges went off, the command center began to drift away from Realm Prime, sliding into a pocket dimension where time moved differently and communication was impossible. The officers who survived the assault would spend the rest of their very long lives watching their empire collapse in slow motion, unable to warn anyone or issue new orders. But Hal wasn't finished. Using access codes he had memorized 40 years ago, codes the collective had never bothered to change, he began shutting down defensive systems across Realm Prime. Shield generators went offline, weapon platforms powered down. The barriers that protected the collective's home dimension from outside attack began to flicker and fail. And in facilities across 17 conquered dimensions, collective forces suddenly found themselves cut off from command, their supply lines disrupted, their tactical networks offline. Local resistance groups, coordinated by a network that had been dormant for years, began to strike at targets that had been carefully mapped and prepared. The war that had been brewing in the shadows for decades suddenly exploded into open rebellion. Hal and his team fought their way back through the failing defenses of Realm Prime. Behind them, the heart of the collective's empire burned. Command centers exploded as their power systems overloaded. Manufacturing facilities that had produced weapons for the conquest of reality melted into slag. The carefully maintained balance that held the dimension together began to collapse. They reached the extraction point just as dimensional barriers started to break down completely. Hal was the last one through the portal, and as it snapped shut behind him, he could see Realm Prime beginning to tear itself apart. He had kept his promise to Martha in his own way. He hadn't gone back to war. He had ended one. The collapse of Realm Prime took 18 hours. Hal watched it happen from his rebuilt cabin, monitoring the destruction through sensors that existed outside normal space-time. What had once been the heart of an interdimensional empire that controlled thousands of realities was tearing itself apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. The collective had built their civilization on stolen technology and enslaved knowledge. They had taken the best ideas from 100 conquered species and combined them without truly understanding how they worked together. Their empire was held together by careful balance and constant maintenance. When Hal removed the central command structure, everything else began to fail in sequence. First, the dimensional anchors failed. Realm Prime had existed partially outside normal reality, held in place by massive machines that bent space and time to their will. Without constant monitoring and adjustment, those machines began to drift out of alignment. The dimension started to slip away from the coordinates that kept it stable. Then the power grids collapsed. The collective used energy sources that required precise control to keep from exploding. With the command center offline and no one able to access the master control codes, safety systems began shutting down power plants across the realm. Within hours, entire continents went dark. But the real damage came from something the collective's builders had never anticipated: rebellion from within. Hal's network included agents who had been working inside collective territory for decades, scientists who had been forced to work on dimensional weapons, engineers who maintained the systems that held conquered worlds in line, soldiers who had been recruited from enslaved populations and trained to fight for their captors. When the command structure collapsed and communication networks went offline, these sleeper agents activated programs they had been preparing for years. Manufacturing facilities that produced universe soldier armor began turning out defective equipment that would fail in combat. Weapons that were supposed to maintain order on occupied worlds suddenly stopped working. Supply ships carrying food and medical supplies to collective forces were redirected to refugee camps. Within 12 hours, the empire that had controlled thousands of dimensions was fighting a civil war on every front. Hal sat on his new porch. He had rebuilt it in 6 hours using tools that technically didn't exist, and read reports from across the dimensional cluster. The collective's slave worlds were declaring independence. Their military commanders were surrendering or switching sides. Their research facilities were being liberated by the same scientists who had been forced to work there. It was exactly the kind of coordinated revolution that intelligence analysts said was impossible when dealing with an empire that large and that well controlled. But those analysts had never met someone who had spent 40 years building a network designed specifically to bring down that empire. "Wraith, this is Echo," came a voice from his communication system. "Status report from Sector 7. The collective garrison has surrendered. Local resistance forces have taken control of the orbital defense platforms. They're requesting instructions." "Tell them to use their own judgment," Hal replied. "They know their situation better than I do." "And if they ask about long-term governance?" Hal thought about that for a moment. Throughout his career, he had fought to protect human space from external threats. But he had also learned that freedom couldn't be given to people. It had to be earned and defended by the people themselves. "Tell them they're on their own," he said finally. "Give them technical support if they need it, but let them figure out how they want to live. That's what freedom means." He could hear Echo's smile in the static. "Understood. What about the remaining collective forces? There are still scattered units across 17 dimensions." "Most of them will surrender once they realize the Empire is gone," Hal said. "The ones who don't will find themselves outnumbered and outgunned by people who have very good reasons to be angry. I don't think we need to worry about organized resistance." That prediction turned out to be correct. Over the next 3 days, collective forces across the dimensional cluster either surrendered to local authorities or simply abandoned their posts and disappeared. Without central command and with their supply lines cut off, there was no point in continuing to fight. The last major holdout was a fortress called the Iron Council, where the collective's highest-ranking civilian leaders had taken shelter with a guard force of several thousand soldiers. They sent a message to every resistance group in the cluster, offering to negotiate terms for their surrender. Hal was invited to the peace talks as an honorary representative of human space. He declined. "I'm retired," he told the messenger who brought the invitation. "Besides, this isn't my fight anymore. It's theirs." The talks lasted a week and ended with the complete dissolution of the collective as a political entity. The surviving leaders agreed to face trial for war crimes on each of the worlds they had oppressed. The remaining universe soldiers were disbanded and their armor was destroyed. The technology that had made dimensional conquest possible was shared freely with the peoples who had been its victims. And in a small cabin in Montana, an old man finished rebuilding his garden. Hal had replaced the plants that were destroyed in the attack. He repaired the irrigation system and replanted the flower beds Martha had loved. He even built a small memorial garden with stones carved with the names of friends who had died fighting the kinds of wars that history books couldn't record. The work took him 2 weeks, partly because he was being careful and partly because he kept getting interrupted by visitors. The first was Director Sarah Chen, who had replaced his old boss at the intelligence agency that officially didn't exist. She arrived in a helicopter that was much quieter than it should have been, accompanied by 2 agents who looked like they could bench press a truck. "Harold," she said, settling into one of the chairs on his new porch. "Hell of a thing you did out there." "I don't know what you're talking about," Hal replied, offering her a cup of coffee from a pot that had been warming on the wood stove. "I'm just a retired guy who grows vegetables." Director Chen laughed. "Right. A retired guy who single-handedly brought down an interdimensional empire that had been giving us nightmares for half a century. The president wants to give you a medal." "The president can keep his medal," Hal said, "and if he's smart, he'll keep my name out of any official reports. That's what I told him you'd say." She pulled out a tablet and showed him satellite images of dimensional research facilities. We're getting reports that former collective technology is showing up on the black market. Weapons, armor, portal generators. Some of it's incomplete, but there are groups out there trying to reverse engineer the stuff. Let me guess, Hal said. You want me to come out of retirement again? I want you to consult. Help us understand what we're dealing with. Train a new generation of agents to handle this kind of threat. She leaned forward. Hal, what you built out there, that network of yours, it's the most effective intelligence operation in human history. We need to learn how to do what you did. Hal was quiet for a long time, looking out at the mountains and thinking about promises made to a dying woman and responsibilities that never seemed to end. I'll send you files, he said finally. Contact lists, technical specifications, tactical analyses, everything I can share without compromising people who are still in the field. But I'm not coming back to work for the government. What if something else shows up? Something worse than the collective? Then you'll handle it, Hal said. Or the people I trained will handle it. Or someone we haven't even met yet will figure out how to handle it. That's how it works. Each generation faces its own monsters. Director Chen finished her coffee and stood to leave. The offer stays open, she said, if you change your mind. After she left, Hal went back to his garden. But that evening, he made some modifications to his security system, just in case. The second visitor was the Universe soldier who had escaped from his forest. Hal was picking tomatoes when he felt the familiar tingle in the air that meant a dimensional portal was opening. He straightened up, his hand automatically checking for the sidearm he wore even while gardening, and waited to see what was coming through. It was the same soldier, but its armor was different now. Simpler. No weapons, no energy signatures, no threatening posture. It walked slowly across the yard and stopped at the edge of the garden, careful not to step on any plants. Harold Morrison, it said, and its voice sounded different. Tired. I have come to speak with you. Speak away, Hal said, continuing to pick tomatoes. My people called me a coward for retreating from your forest, the soldier said. But when Realm Prime fell and the command structure collapsed, I realized something. You had given me a choice that day. Life or death. I chose life, and because of that choice, I survived to see the end of the empire I had served. Hal looked up from his plants. And now? Now I want to understand. How did one old human destroy an empire that had conquered thousands of worlds? Hal set down his basket of tomatoes and really looked at the soldier. Up close, without its weapons and combat stance, it looked smaller, more vulnerable, almost human in its uncertainty. I didn't destroy your empire, Hal said. I just knocked over the first domino. Everything that happened after that was because your people built their whole civilization on oppression and fear. Take away the central control and the whole thing collapses because nobody actually believed in it. And the network you used? The agents and rebels and resistance groups? Those people were fighting long before I showed up, Hal said. I just gave them a way to coordinate. The real heroes are the ones who spent years risking their lives to gather intelligence and sabotage collective operations. The ones who kept hope alive on worlds where hope was illegal. The ones who never stopped believing that freedom was possible. The soldier was quiet for a long time. Then, what happens to people like me now? Former soldiers who served the collective? Same thing that happens to everyone else, Hal said. You make choices about what kind of person you want to be. You live with the consequences of those choices. You try to do better tomorrow than you did today. It is that simple? It's that hard, Hal corrected. Simple and hard aren't the same thing. The soldier nodded slowly. I have been thinking about the choice you gave me, life or death. I think I understand now why you let me live. Why's that? Because you knew that seeing the empire fall would be worse punishment than dying for it. Hal considered that. Maybe. Or maybe I was just tired of killing people and thought it would be nice to let one live for a change. The soldier turned to go, then stopped. Will you ever come out of retirement again? I hope not, Hal said honestly. I've had enough war for one lifetime. But if something threatens the people I care about, if some new empire decides that humans are an easy target, if some other bunch of bullies thinks they can push around folks who just want to be left alone. He smiled, and it was not a particularly pleasant expression. Well, I guess they'll find out what happened to the last bunch. After the soldier left, Hal finished his gardening as the sun set behind the mountains. Then he went inside and made himself dinner, grilled fish, vegetables from his garden, and bread he had baked that morning. It was a good meal, eaten in peace, in a home he had built with his own hands, in a world that was safe because people like him had made it safe. Before bed, he checked his communication system one more time. Reports were still coming in from across the dimensional cluster. Former collective worlds were establishing new governments. Trade agreements were being negotiated. Scientific knowledge that had been suppressed for decades was being shared freely. The universe was becoming a better place. Hal shut down the system and went to bed in his small cabin, surrounded by mountains and forests, and the quiet sounds of a world at peace. He had kept his promises, both to the living and the dead. He had protected the innocent and punished the guilty. He had fought the good fight and won the final victory. And in the morning he would tend his garden and read his books and watch the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, just like any other retired old man who had earned his peace. The monsters were gone, the empire had fallen, and Harold Morrison was finally, truly retired. At least until the next time someone made the mistake of thinking that humans were easy targets, because some lessons, it seemed, had to be taught more than once.